"Don't point those guns at her." The voice came low and deadly from the far side of the penthouse, and in less than a second, 12 armed men froze where they stood. Rain hammered against the towering glass windows overlooking Manhattan, turning the city lights into blurred rivers of gold and white across the storm-dark skyline. In the center of that silence stood Naomi Carter, soaked from the cold October rain, her faded gray hoodie dripping onto polished black marble floors that probably cost more than everything she owned combined. Her cheap supermarket sneakers squeaked softly as she stood motionless beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by men in tailored black suits whose watches gleamed beneath the recessed lighting like tiny knives. But nobody was looking at her anymore. Every eye in the room was locked on the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest. 3 seconds earlier, the child had been screaming so hard his tiny face had turned crimson. The sound had filled the $20 million penthouse for nearly 3 straight days. Doctors came and went. Elite nannies quit before sunrise. One pediatric specialist from the Upper East Side had called it extreme infant distress caused by trauma, though nobody dared repeat those words within hearing distance of Adrian Kong. Because nothing in Adrian Kang's world was ever supposed to sound weak. He ruled an empire built on silence, loyalty, and fear. Men lowered their voices when his name entered a room. Politicians shook his hand carefully. Wall Street executives waited hours for 5 minutes of his attention. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, the most feared Korean crime boss in New York stood completely still beside the rain-streaked windows of his penthouse while his 8-month-old son slept in the arms of a poor black cleaning woman nobody had noticed 10 minutes ago. Naomi could feel all of them staring at her. The guards near the fireplace. The exhausted nanny trembling beside the dining table. The house manager clutching his tablet with pale nervous fingers. Even the chef standing frozen near the kitchen entrance. Nobody understood what had just happened. Naomi barely understood it herself. One moment the baby had been crying so hard his tiny hands shook against the nanny's uniform. The next, he had reached toward Naomi with trembling fingers the instant she stepped forward. Instinct had moved faster than thought. She had caught him gently against her chest just as one of the guards reached inside his jacket. Then came the humming. Soft. Fragile. Almost invisible beneath the sound of the rain. An old lullaby Naomi hadn't sung out loud in years. The moment the melody touched the room, the baby stopped crying. Not slowly. Instantly. The silence that followed felt unreal. Heavy. Sacred. Dangerous. Tiny fingers now curled tightly into Naomi's hoodie as the child slept against her heartbeat like he belonged there. Across the penthouse, Adrian Kong stared at her with an expression no one in that room had likely ever seen before. It was not anger. It was not suspicion. It looked far worse. It looked like grief remembering how to breathe. Nobody moved for several long seconds. The storm outside continued to lash against the glass walls of the penthouse, but inside Adrian Kang's home, even the rain seemed quieter now, as though the entire city itself was holding its breath. Naomi stood near the center of the enormous living room beneath a chandelier that scattered pale gold light across the marble floor, afraid that even the smallest movement might wake the sleeping child against her chest. She could feel the warmth of the baby's tiny body through her damp hoodie. His breathing had finally become soft and steady instead of sharp and desperate. The silence felt almost impossible after 72 straight hours of screaming. Somewhere near the fireplace, one of the guards slowly lowered his hand from the earpiece attached to his collar. Another exchanged a nervous glance with the nanny, whose mascara had smudged beneath exhausted eyes after days without proper sleep. The woman looked close to tears. Nobody in that room understood how a stranger carrying a mop bucket had succeeded where private nurses, child specialists, and elite caregivers had all failed. Naomi swallowed carefully. Her arms already ached slightly from holding the child, but she did not dare shift her weight. The last thing she wanted was attention from men like these. Men dressed in tailored black wool and polished Italian shoes who carried themselves with the cold discipline of people used to obedience. Naomi knew exactly what kind of world she had accidentally stepped into tonight. Everybody in Manhattan knew the name Adrian Kong even if nobody said it too loudly. She had heard stories whispered during late subway rides home from work and inside laundromats at 2 in the morning. Stories about business deals, private security teams, politicians attending silent dinners high above the city skyline. But standing inside his penthouse now felt stranger than the rumors. It did not feel powerful. It felt lonely. The massive room looked more like a museum than a home. Black marble stretched endlessly beneath soft recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a storm drowning the city below in silver rain. A grand piano sat untouched near the windows beside a crystal decanter filled with whiskey nobody had poured. Even the expensive leather furniture looked cold. There were no family photographs. No laughter. No signs that a child belonged here except for the small sleeping boy pressed against Naomi's chest. Adrian remained near the windows with one hand resting inside his pocket, his dark tailored coat hanging perfectly against his broad shoulders. He had not taken his eyes off Naomi once. Up close, he looked younger than she expected, maybe early 40s, though grief had carved something older into his face. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of wealth could erase. His expression remained unreadable, but Naomi noticed one detail immediately. The terrifying men surrounding him watched him more carefully than they watched her. That frightened her more than the guns had. Finally, Adrian spoke again, his voice low enough that everyone leaned forward slightly to hear it. "What song were you humming?" Naomi blinked softly, surprised by the question. "I do not know," she answered quietly. "Just something my mother used to sing." Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. For the first time since she entered the penthouse, his composure shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough for the room to notice. The nanny slowly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. One of the older guards lowered his eyes toward the floor. Naomi felt the atmosphere change without understanding why. Adrian took one slow step closer, staring at the sleeping child curled peacefully against her chest. When he spoke again, his voice sounded quieter than before, almost as if the words heard on the way out. "My wife used to sing that exact lullaby to him every night." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the sleeping baby as the weight of Adrian Kang's words settled over the room like another layer of silence. Outside, lightning flickered faintly beyond the rain-streaked glass walls, illuminating the skyline in pale silver flashes before darkness swallowed it again. The penthouse remained still except for the soft hum of the city 40 stories below them. Naomi looked down at the child resting peacefully against her chest, his tiny cheek pressed against the faded fabric of her hoodie as though he had known her forever. It made no sense. Nothing about tonight made sense. Naomi had only come to the building because the overnight janitorial supervisor called her an hour earlier begging for extra help after a pipe burst in one of the service corridors downstairs. She almost said no. Her feet still ached from cleaning subway platforms all week, and her electricity bill sat unpaid on the tiny kitchen counter of her apartment in Queens. But overtime meant groceries. Overtime meant keeping the lights on another week. So she came. She never imagined she would end up standing inside one of the richest penthouses in Manhattan holding the son of Adrian Kong. "What is your name?" Adrian finally asked. Naomi hesitated before answering softly. "Naomi Carter." Adrian nodded once, almost absently, as though storing the name somewhere private inside his mind. He stepped closer again, slower this time, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. The guards immediately straightened, watching him carefully. Naomi noticed how every person in the room measured their breathing around this man, adjusting themselves to his mood like sailors watching dangerous weather. But Adrian's attention never left the child. Elias remained asleep against Naomi's chest, one tiny hand curled around the drawstring of her hoodie. The dark circles beneath Adrian's eyes deepened slightly as he watched his son resting peacefully for the first time in days. "He has not slept longer than 20 minutes since the funeral," the nanny whispered quietly from near the dining table. Her voice trembled with exhaustion. "Every time someone puts him down, he starts screaming again." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward Adrian. Funeral. The word explained everything the expensive walls could not hide. The coldness. The silence. The untouched whiskey beside the piano. Grief lingered inside the penthouse like smoke nobody could clear away. Naomi understood that kind of silence too well. She remembered sitting inside St. Mercy Hospital 3 winters ago while machines beeped softly around her 6-year-old son, Caleb. She remembered the hollow fluorescent lights. The smell of antiseptic. The unbearable quiet after the doctors stopped talking. Pain recognized pain. Maybe babies understood that better than adults did. One of the younger guards shifted awkwardly near the fireplace before muttering under his breath, "This is insane." Adrian's expression changed instantly. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. The guard immediately lowered his eyes toward the floor. Nobody spoke after that. Naomi swallowed nervously. She had spent her whole life avoiding powerful men. Men who looked through people like her instead of at them. Yet Adrian Kong was staring at her now with something stranger than suspicion. It looked almost like confusion. As if the walls around his carefully controlled world had cracked open without permission. The baby stirred slightly against Naomi's chest, letting out a soft sleepy sigh before nestling closer toward the sound of her heartbeat. Naomi instinctively resumed the gentle humming under her breath. The moment the melody returned, Adrian's face shifted again. Not fear. Not anger. Something infinitely more fragile. 4. The first time all night, the terrifying man standing before her no longer looked like the king of a criminal empire. He looked like a grieving husband hearing his wife's voice echo through the dark. The storm outside showed no signs of slowing. Rain slid endlessly down the massive windows of the penthouse like silver threads melting across glass, blurring the lights of Manhattan into soft streaks of gold and white. Somewhere far below, sirens echoed faintly through the city streets, distant enough to feel unreal from 40 stories above the ground. But inside Adrian Kang's home, nobody cared about the storm anymore. The attention of every person in the room remained fixed on the sleeping child in Naomi Carter's arms. The house manager quietly dismissed 2 exhausted nurses who had been standing near the hallway for nearly an hour. They left without argument, carrying medical bags and drained expressions beneath the soft amber lighting. Naomi noticed the relief on their faces as they disappeared toward the elevator. It was the kind of relief people wore after surviving something emotionally unbearable. Adrian slowly walked toward the fireplace, loosening the cuff of his black coat with absent fingers before stopping beside the grand piano near the windows. Up close, Naomi noticed the thin layer of dust across several piano keys. Nobody had touched the instrument in a long time. The silence stretching through the penthouse felt old now, heavier than exhaustion. It felt lived in. Elias stirred softly against Naomi's chest again, but the moment she resumed humming under her breath, he relaxed immediately. The tiny crease between his brows disappeared. Even asleep, the child looked tired. Naomi felt something twist painfully inside her chest. Babies were not meant to carry grief. "How long has it been?" Naomi asked quietly before she could stop herself. The question lingered in the room for a second. Adrian kept his eyes on the rain outside the windows. 3 months, he answered finally. His voice remained calm, but something underneath it sounded hollow. "My wife passed away in July." Naomi lowered her eyes instinctively. "I am sorry." Adrian gave a small nod. Though he did not turn around. "So am I." The honesty of the answer unsettled the room more than anger would have. Men like Adrian Kong were not supposed to sound broken. One of the older guards near the hallway shifted uncomfortably before pretending to check his phone. The nanny quietly wiped beneath her eyes. Naomi understood then that grief had become the true ruler of this penthouse long before she arrived tonight. It sat in the corners of the ceilings. In the untouched piano. In the untouched whiskey. In the silence every person seemed terrified to interrupt. Elias suddenly made a soft sleepy sound and tightened his tiny fingers around Naomi's hoodie again. The gesture was so small it almost broke her heart. Naomi carefully adjusted him against her shoulder, moving with the same instinctive gentleness she once used with Caleb years ago. The memory arrived without warning. Tiny pajamas fresh from the dryer. Warm little hands gripping her thumb. Lullabies whispered beside hospital windows at midnight. Her throat tightened immediately. Grief recognized itself in strange ways. Adrian finally turned around slowly. His dark eyes settled on Naomi with quiet intensity. "You have children?" The question caught her off guard. Naomi hesitated for a moment before answering softly, "I had a son." The room became still all over again. Adrian's expression changed slightly, almost too subtle to notice, but Naomi saw it. Not pity. Recognition. Across the penthouse, thunder rolled faintly through the storm clouds while the chandelier light reflected softly against the marble floors. For the first time that night, Adrian Kong looked at Naomi Carter not as part of the staff, not as an inconvenience standing in his home, but as someone who understood the language of loss without needing it explained. And somehow, that realization frightened him more than anything else. Naomi did not know how much time had passed. The storm continued outside the towering windows, wrapping Manhattan in silver rain and distant thunder, while the penthouse remained suspended in an almost dreamlike stillness. Elias had not cried once since falling asleep against her chest. Not once. The difference was so shocking that even the air inside the room felt lighter, as though everyone had finally remembered how to breathe again. The nanny quietly disappeared toward the kitchen to make coffee for the exhausted staff. One guard dimmed the chandelier lights slightly until the marble walls glowed with a softer amber warmth instead of harsh gold. Somewhere near the hallway, a phone vibrated briefly before being silenced immediately. Nobody wanted noise near the sleeping child. Naomi stood near the fireplace now, gently rocking Elias without thinking about it. The motion came from memory more than intention. Small slow movements learned years ago in dark hospital rooms and tiny apartments filled with lullabies and prayer. Adrian watched her from across the room with unreadable eyes. He had loosened his black tie at some point, though Naomi doubted he even realized it. The carefully controlled image of Adrian Kong seemed to be unraveling inch by inch tonight, not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly enough to frighten the people around him. Powerful men terrified others when they shouted. Truly dangerous men terrified people when they became silent. Naomi finally noticed the framed photograph resting near the piano. A woman stood beside Adrian on a snowy rooftop beneath glowing city lights, laughing with her head tilted slightly backward while Adrian looked at her instead of the camera. It was the first real emotion Naomi had seen attached to him all night. Happiness looked strange on his face, almost unfamiliar. "Her name was Hannah," Adrian said softly from behind her. Naomi turned slightly toward him. Adrian stepped closer to the photograph but did not touch it. "She hated this apartment," he admitted quietly. Said it looked like a luxury hotel pretending to be a home. For the first time all evening, something faintly human flickered across his face. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one. Naomi looked around again at the towering ceilings, black marble, and endless glass walls reflecting the rain outside. Hannah had been right. The penthouse was beautiful in the same way museums were beautiful. Impressive. Expensive. Untouchable. But not warm. Never warm. She was the only person Elias slept for, Adrian continued after a long silence. After she passed away, he stopped sleeping. Then he stopped eating normally. Then the crying started. His voice remained calm, but Naomi noticed how tightly his fingers curled near his side. Grief lived inside controlled people differently. It hid beneath perfect posture and expensive suits until something cracked it open. Naomi carefully brushed her hand against the baby's tiny curls. "Babies know when somebody is hurting," she whispered gently. Adrian's eyes lifted toward her immediately. Naomi lowered her gaze, embarrassed she had spoken so freely. "My son was like that," she added quietly. "Whenever I cried, he would crawl into my lap even before he could talk." The room became still again. Adrian studied her face carefully now, not as a billionaire studying an employee, but as a grieving parent searching for something impossible to explain. "What happened to him?" he asked. Naomi's throat tightened instantly. She looked down at Elias instead of answering right away. The soft weight of the sleeping child against her chest suddenly felt painfully familiar. "Leukemia," she whispered finally. "Caleb was 6. The silence afterward felt enormous. Rain continued to slide down the glass walls while the city glittered below them like another universe entirely. Adrian said nothing for several seconds. Then, quietly enough that only Naomi could hear it, he asked, "How did you survive that?" Naomi stared at the sleeping baby in her arms before answering with the kind of honesty grief leaves behind when it strips everything else away. "Some days," she whispered softly, "I do not think I did." The confession lingered quietly between them long after Naomi finished speaking. Outside the penthouse windows, the storm drifted deeper into the night, wrapping Manhattan in silver rain and flickering reflections that danced across the black marble floors. The city below still moved with restless energy, yellow taxis threading through wet streets, distant headlights glowing beneath the clouds, but inside Adrian Kang's home, time itself seemed to slow around the sleeping child in Naomi's arms. Nobody interrupted the silence. Even the guards stationed near the hallway remained unusually still, their sharp eyes lowered respectfully toward the floor instead of toward their employer. It was as though grief itself had entered the room and demanded silence from everyone present. Adrian stood near the grand piano with one hand resting lightly against the polished ebony surface. The faint amber lighting softened the hard lines of his face just enough to reveal the exhaustion beneath them. Naomi realized then that he looked less like a feared kingpin tonight and more like a man who had forgotten how to exist after losing the person who made his life feel human. Elias shifted softly in his sleep, his tiny fingers still wrapped around the fabric of Naomi's hoodie as though letting go might wake him back into sorrow. Naomi gently brushed her thumb across the child's back, instinctively soothing him with slow rhythmic motions. The movement stirred something painful inside Adrian's expression again. "Hannah used to do that," he said quietly. Naomi lifted her eyes toward him. Adrian looked down at his son with a distant sadness that seemed to pull him somewhere far beyond the penthouse walls. Whenever he was scared, he continued softly, she would rub small circles against his back until he fell asleep. His voice nearly disappeared on the last words. Naomi swallowed carefully. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a man surrounded by wealth, influence, and power speak with such helplessness. Grief had reduced all those things to nothing. Money could buy penthouses, private doctors, and security teams. It could not teach someone how to survive silence after loss. One of the house staff quietly entered carrying a folded cashmere blanket before hesitating uncertainly near Naomi. The young woman looked terrified to step closer without permission. Adrian noticed immediately and gave a small nod. "Bring it here." The employee obeyed quickly, carefully draping the blanket across Elias without waking him. Naomi thanked her softly. The young woman blinked in surprise, as though she was unaccustomed to hearing gratitude inside these walls. Then she quietly disappeared again toward the kitchen corridor. Adrian noticed that too. Naomi could tell by the slight tightening in his jaw. "People are afraid of you," Naomi said gently before she could stop herself. The words escaped naturally, carried by exhaustion and honesty instead of caution. Several guards immediately stiffened across the room. Naomi regretted speaking the second the sentence left her mouth. But Adrian did not react with anger. He looked almost thoughtful instead. After a long silence, he answered quietly, "Fear keeps dangerous people predictable." Naomi looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. "Maybe," she whispered softly. "But children are not predictable." Something faint shifted in Adrian's face then. Not amusement exactly. More like recognition. Elias suddenly made another sleepy sound before nestling closer against Naomi's shoulder beneath the soft blanket. The tiny movement drew every eye in the room instantly, but the baby remained peaceful. Naomi resumed humming quietly under her breath. The lullaby floated gently through the penthouse once more, soft enough to blend with the sound of rain against glass. Adrian closed his eyes briefly the moment he heard it again. Just for 1 second. One small exhausted second. But Naomi saw it clearly. Beneath the expensive suit, the reputation, and the terrifying silence surrounding him, Adrian Kong was no longer fighting to protect an empire tonight. He was simply a grieving father desperately trying to remember what hope sounded like. The rain finally began to soften sometime after midnight, fading from violent sheets against the windows into a quieter steady rhythm that wrapped itself around the penthouse like distant static. The city below still glowed restlessly beneath the clouds, but the atmosphere inside Adrian Kang's home had changed completely. Hours earlier, the penthouse felt tense enough to crack beneath the sound of a crying child. Now, for the first time in weeks, silence no longer felt hostile. It felt fragile. Precious. Naomi sat carefully near the fireplace with Elias sleeping across her chest beneath the cashmere blanket, his tiny breasts warm against her neck. She had not intended to stay this long. Every clock in the apartment reminded her how late it had become. The janitorial shift downstairs had likely ended over an hour ago. Her phone, resting forgotten inside her cleaning cart near the service elevator, probably held 3 missed calls from the supervisor by now. But nobody had asked her to leave. And somehow, she could not bring herself to wake the child. Adrian remained nearby, seated quietly in a leather chair facing the windows. His posture looked composed at first glance, but exhaustion lingered in every detail now that Naomi knew how to see it. The loosened tie. The untouched whiskey. The way his gaze drifted repeatedly toward Elias as though reassuring himself the child was truly asleep. Powerful men often carried themselves like they controlled the world. Grieving people carried themselves like the world had already ended once. Naomi understood that difference too well. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. One of the older guards stepped into the room carrying a thin folder. His silver hair was neatly combed, his black suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour, but even he looked more cautious tonight than before. "Sir," he said respectfully, extending the folder toward Adrian. The pediatric specialist sent another report. Adrian accepted it without speaking. Naomi tried not to look interested, but she noticed his expression darken slightly as he opened the papers beneath the soft lamplight. His jaw tightened almost immediately. "They still want him sedated," Adrian muttered coldly. The guard remained silent. Naomi lowered her eyes instinctively. She knew enough about grief to recognize helpless frustration when she heard it. Adrian stared down at the report for several long seconds before quietly tossing the folder onto the piano bench nearby. "Every expert keeps treating him like a problem to solve," he said bitterly. "Nobody asks why he is hurting." The room fell silent again. Naomi looked down at Elias sleeping peacefully against her chest. His tiny fingers had finally loosened their grip on her hoodie, relaxed enough now to trust the warmth holding him. Babies understood absence in ways adults underestimated. They noticed missing voices, missing smells, missing heartbeats. "Children feel when love disappears," Naomi whispered softly. Adrian looked toward her immediately. Naomi hesitated before continuing. "After Caleb got sick, there were nights he would wake up crying even before the pain started. I used to think maybe children sense fear before adults admit it exists." Adrian stared at her quietly, saying nothing. But something in his expression shifted again, softer this time. Less guarded. Across the room, the older guard suddenly cleared his throat carefully before speaking. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "you should probably rest." Adrian did not even glance toward him. "Leave us." The guard blinked once in surprise. Naomi noticed the entire room subtly freeze again. Adrian rarely repeated himself. The guard gave a respectful nod before quietly exiting with the others. One by one, the penthouse emptied until only the storm, the sleeping child, and the 2 grieving strangers remained beneath the soft amber lights. The silence afterward no longer felt intimidating. It felt honest. Adrian slowly leaned back into the leather chair, studying Naomi with exhausted eyes. You are the first person Elias has trusted since Hannah died, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked down at the sleeping baby and gently brushed the blanket higher against his tiny shoulder. No, she whispered softly. I think he just recognized somebody else who misses someone too. The penthouse felt different after everyone left. Without the guards standing near the walls and without the nervous movement of exhausted staff crossing the marble floors, the enormous apartment no longer felt like the headquarters of a feared empire. It felt strangely hollow. Quiet in the way empty churches felt quiet after midnight. The rain outside had softened into a gentle mist now, blurring the city skyline into pale watercolor streaks beyond the towering windows. Somewhere below, Manhattan still pulsed with sleepless energy, but up here the world had narrowed to the soft breathing of a sleeping baby and the silence shared between two people who understood loss too intimately to explain it aloud. Naomi carefully adjusted Elias in her arms as she sat near the fireplace. The warmth from the flames cast soft amber light across the child's peaceful face, replacing the tension that had twisted his tiny features earlier that evening. He looked younger asleep. Smaller. Vulnerable in a way that made Naomi's chest ache unexpectedly. She remembered how Caleb used to sleep after difficult nights at the hospital, exhausted from crying but still reaching for her hand even in dreams. Some kinds of pain never truly left the body. They simply learned how to hide quietly beneath the skin. Adrian remained seated across from her, one arm resting against the leather chair while his gaze drifted occasionally toward the rain-covered windows. The silence between them no longer felt awkward. It felt tired. Honest. Somewhere near the kitchen, a coffee machine hummed softly before stopping again. Naomi realized suddenly how late it had become. I should probably go, she said quietly, though the words felt strange the moment she spoke them. Adrian's eyes lifted immediately toward her. Elias shifted slightly against Naomi's chest at the sound of her voice but did not wake. Adrian looked at his son for several long seconds before speaking. If you leave, he admitted quietly, he will probably wake up crying again. There was no manipulation in his voice. No command. Just exhausted truth. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the sleeping child. She knew Adrian was probably right. Babies recognized comfort quickly, especially after trauma. The thought of handing Elias back only to hear him screaming again made her stomach tighten painfully. I work mornings too, Naomi said softly. Subway station cleaning in Queens starts at 6. Adrian stared at her for a moment as though trying to imagine someone living a life completely opposite from his own. Naomi suddenly became aware again of her damp hoodie, her tired sneakers, and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals lingering on her sleeves despite the expensive warmth surrounding her. She did not belong inside places like this. People like her usually entered through service elevators and disappeared before sunrise. Adrian leaned forward slightly. His hands clasped loosely together. When was the last time somebody took care of you? The question caught Naomi completely off guard. She blinked softly, unsure how to answer. Nobody had asked her something like that in years. Not after Caleb died. Not after hospital bills swallowed everything she owned. Not after life became survival instead of living. Naomi gave a small uncertain laugh under her breath, though sadness lingered inside it. I do not really remember. Adrian looked down briefly before nodding once, almost to himself. The firelight reflected softly across the sharp lines of his face, revealing exhaustion that power could no longer conceal. Then, quietly enough to almost disappear beneath the sound of the rain, he said something nobody in Naomi Carter's position would ever expect to hear from a man like Adrian Kong. Stay tonight. Naomi froze. Across the penthouse, the city lights shimmered faintly against the glass while Elias slept peacefully between them, unaware that his tiny heartbeat had already begun changing something neither adult fully understood yet. Naomi stared at Adrian for several long seconds, certain she must have misunderstood him. The fire crackled softly nearby, casting slow golden light across the marble floors while rain continued to whisper against the enormous windows surrounding the penthouse. Somewhere beyond the glass, Manhattan glowed beneath the storm clouds like another universe entirely, distant and unreachable from the strange quiet wrapped around the room now. Elias slept peacefully between them, his tiny body warm and heavy against Naomi's chest beneath the cashmere blanket. "Stay tonight." The words still echoed inside her mind. "Nobody like Adrian," Kong asked twice. Naomi knew that much instinctively. Yet there had been no threat in his voice. No cold authority. Just exhaustion. Just honesty. Naomi shifted slightly in the armchair, careful not to wake the child. "Mr. Kong," she began softly, "I do not think that is a good idea." Adrian's expression remained calm, though tiredness shadowed every feature now. "Why?" Naomi almost laughed at the question. The answer felt obvious. She looked down at her worn sneakers resting against marble floors polished enough to reflect the chandelier light above them. "Because people like me do not belong in places like this." Adrian's gaze followed hers briefly before returning to her face. "Tonight," he said quietly, "my son disagrees." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than arrogance would have. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately, unsure what to say. She had spent years becoming invisible. Invisible on subway platforms before sunrise. Invisible inside office towers after midnight. Invisible to wealthy people who passed her every day carrying coffees more expensive than her hourly wage. Invisibility kept life simple. Safe. But tonight, for reasons Naomi could not understand, Adrian Kong looked directly at her as though she mattered. The realization made her uncomfortable. "I have work tomorrow," she said gently. "And I still need to get home to Queens eventually." Adrian leaned back slightly in the leather chair, studying the sleeping child instead of her now. "You can leave in the morning after breakfast." Naomi blinked softly. Breakfast. The word sounded strangely human coming from someone surrounded by armed security and whispered rumors. Before she could answer, Elias stirred faintly against her chest. His tiny face tightened for half a second, the beginning of another cry threatening to surface from sleep. Instantly, Naomi resumed the soft humming beneath her breath. The child relaxed immediately. Adrian watched the moment carefully, his expression shifting with something dangerously close to hope. Naomi noticed at the same instant he realized she had seen it. He looked away toward the windows almost immediately afterward. "He misses her," Adrian admitted quietly into the silence. Naomi knew he was no longer speaking only about the baby. The penthouse itself missed Hannah. Her absence lingered everywhere. In the untouched piano. In the empty chair beside the windows. In the way nobody laughed inside these walls anymore. Grief had become architecture here. Naomi looked down at Elias sleeping peacefully against her chest. "So do you," she whispered softly. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood from the leather chair and walked toward the fireplace where Naomi sat. Up close, he no longer looked untouchable. Just tired. Deeply tired in the way people became after carrying pain too long alone. He stopped beside her chair before carefully reaching down to adjust the edge of the blanket near Elias's shoulder with surprising gentleness. The child barely stirred. Naomi watched Adrian's hand freeze there for half a second longer than necessary, as though touching his son without hearing screams still felt unfamiliar now. Then Adrian looked toward Naomi again, his voice quieter than before. "There are guest rooms upstairs," he said softly. "But somehow I do not think Elias is going to let you out of his sight tonight." Naomi followed Adrian upstairs just after 2 in the morning, moving carefully through the silent penthouse with Elias still asleep against her shoulder. The enormous apartment seemed even larger at night. Hallways lined with dark wood and soft recessed lighting stretched quietly beneath towering ceilings while expensive artwork watched from the walls in solemn silence. Every surface reflected wealth, precision, and control. Yet none of it erased the loneliness woven through the place like invisible thread. Adrian walked a few steps ahead of her, his black dress shirt slightly wrinkled now beneath the low amber lights, exhaustion softening the sharp edges of his usually untouchable appearance. He moved quietly for a man people feared. Naomi noticed that. The only sound between them was the faint creak of floorboards beneath careful footsteps and the distant whisper of rain against the windows overlooking the sleeping city. At the end of the hallway, Adrian slowly opened a door leading into a spacious guest suite. Warm golden light spilled across cream-colored walls, soft linen curtains, and a bed large enough to belong inside a luxury hotel. Naomi froze instinctively near the doorway. The room alone probably cost more per night than her monthly rent in Queens. "You can stay here," Adrian said quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately. "I cannot afford anything like this." Adrian looked genuinely confused for half a second before understanding crossed his face. "Naomi," he said softly, "I am not charging you." Embarrassment warmed her cheeks instantly. She hated how poverty trained people to apologize simply for existing inside beautiful places. Adrian stepped aside slightly, allowing her room to enter fully while keeping his voice low enough not to disturb Elias. "There are clothes in the closet from Hannah's charity events," he added carefully. "Some still have tags." The mention of his wife softened the atmosphere again immediately. Naomi stepped slowly inside the room, overwhelmed by the warmth after spending most of her life inside cramped apartments, fluorescent subway stations, and cold break rooms that smelled like bleach and vending machine coffee. Everything here felt impossibly gentle. Thick carpets softened her footsteps. A fireplace glowed quietly near the windows. Fresh white towels rested neatly folded at the end of the bed. For a moment, Naomi forgot how tired she was. Elias shifted softly against her shoulder with a sleepy sigh. Adrian instinctively stepped closer before stopping himself halfway. Naomi noticed immediately. Grief had made him cautious around his own child, as though fear of triggering another wave of crying haunted every movement now. "You can hold him," Naomi whispered gently. Adrian looked startled by the suggestion. The hesitation in his eyes lasted only a second before he slowly reached forward. Naomi carefully transferred Elias into his father's arms. The baby stirred briefly, tiny fingers curling against Adrian's shirt, but he did not wake. Adrian froze completely once he realized that. No screaming. No panic. Just quiet sleep. The expression on Adrian's face changed so subtly Naomi almost missed it. Relief mixed with disbelief in a way that looked almost painful. He held Elias carefully against his chest as though afraid the moment might disappear if he breathed too hard. "He has not let me hold him this long since July," Adrian admitted softly. Naomi watched father and son beneath the warm golden light, and for the first time since entering the penthouse, she saw something stronger than fear inside these walls. Love. Exhausted. Damaged. Grieving. But still there beneath everything else. Adrian gently brushed his fingers against Elias's tiny curls before lifting his eyes toward Naomi again. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words landed differently than anything else he had said that night. Not because of the money surrounding him. Not because powerful men rarely thanked people like Naomi Carter. But because he sounded sincere in a way deeply lonely people often did when hope returned unexpectedly. Naomi swallowed carefully, suddenly emotional for reasons she could not fully explain. "You do not have to thank me," she whispered softly. Adrian looked down at his sleeping son again before answering in a voice roughened by exhaustion and grief. "Tonight," he said quietly, "I think I do." Naomi barely slept that night. Even after Adrian quietly carried Elias into the nursery beside the guest suite and the penthouse finally settled into complete silence, her body remained too tense to fully rest. She lay awake beneath impossibly soft sheets staring at the ceiling while faint city light filtered through the curtains in pale silver ribbons. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and clean linen instead of bleach and subway dust. It felt unfamiliar in a way luxury often did to people who spent most of their lives surviving. Around 4 a.m, Naomi finally drifted into a shallow exhausted sleep, only to wake again just after sunrise to the distant sound of soft piano music echoing somewhere down the hallway. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality returned all at once. The marble penthouse. The storm. Adrian Kong. Elias sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Naomi sat up slowly, disoriented by the warmth and quiet surrounding her. Sunlight now poured through the windows beyond the curtains, washing the room in soft gold. The storm had passed completely overnight. Manhattan glittered beneath a cold clear October morning, rooftops shining faintly from the rain. Naomi quickly fixed the borrowed cream-colored sweater she found folded neatly across a chair nearby. One of Hannah's old charity event sweaters, probably worth more than Naomi earned in 2 weeks. The thought made her uncomfortable all over again. She quietly stepped into the hallway, following the sound of piano music drifting softly through the penthouse. The melody stopped the moment she entered the living room. Adrian sat alone at the grand piano near the windows, one hand resting against the ivory keys while morning sunlight framed him in pale gold. He looked different in daylight. Less frightening somehow. Still powerful. Still controlled. But human in a way darkness had hidden the night before. Elias sat in a small chair nearby wearing soft gray pajamas, awake and calm while quietly chewing on a stuffed rabbit's ear. The sight alone nearly made Naomi emotional. No screaming. No panic. Just peace. Adrian lifted his eyes toward her as she entered. "Good morning," he said quietly. Naomi blinked softly, caught off guard by how normal the words sounded coming from him. "Good morning." Elias immediately noticed Naomi standing there and reached both tiny arms toward her without hesitation. A small sound escaped him, not quite a word but close enough to make Adrian freeze beside the piano. Naomi walked over instinctively and lifted the baby into her arms. Elias settled against her shoulder immediately with complete trust. Adrian watched the moment carefully, something unreadable moving through his expression again. "That is the first sound he has made without crying in weeks," he admitted softly. Naomi looked down at Elias in surprise. The baby touched the necklace around her neck curiously before resting his head against her shoulder again. Children always knew where safety lived. A quiet housekeeper entered from the kitchen carrying breakfast on silver trays before stopping abruptly at the sight of Adrian sitting at the piano. Naomi realized instantly that this too was unusual. The young woman placed the trays down carefully without speaking, though Naomi noticed the surprise lingering on her face before she quietly disappeared again. Adrian followed Naomi's gaze toward the hallway. "I stopped playing after Hannah died," he admitted quietly. Naomi looked toward the piano keys reflecting sunlight beneath his fingertips. "What changed?" Adrian watched Elias resting peacefully in Naomi's arms before answering. "Last night," he said softly, "this apartment sounded alive again." The words settled deeply into the silence between them. Naomi looked around the enormous penthouse flooded with morning light now. For the first time since arriving, the place no longer felt cold. The marble still gleamed. The skyline still stretched endlessly beyond the windows. But grief no longer felt like the loudest thing in the room. Hope had entered quietly sometime during the night, carried in the arms of a tired woman who once believed nobody would ever truly see her again. Naomi intended to leave after breakfast. She told herself that repeatedly while standing beside the kitchen counter later that morning watching Elias play quietly with the stuffed rabbit in her lap. The penthouse no longer felt like the cold fortress she had entered the night before. Sunlight spilled across the marble floors in warm golden sheets while soft piano music drifted quietly from hidden speakers overhead. Somewhere down the hallway, staff members moved with calmer footsteps now that the endless crying had finally stopped. Even the air smelled different. Fresh coffee. Warm bread. Life returning slowly to rooms that had forgotten how to breathe. Yet Naomi still felt like an outsider inside someone else's world. She folded Hannah's borrowed sweater carefully across the back of a chair before reaching for her old hoodie draped near the door. The faded fabric looked painfully small beside the luxury surrounding it. Adrian entered the kitchen just as Naomi pulled the hoodie over her shoulders. He paused immediately when he realized what she was doing. "You are leaving?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded softly while adjusting Elias against her hip. The baby had already begun reaching for her every time she moved farther than a few feet away. "I should," she answered gently. my supervisor probably thinks I disappeared. Adrian glanced toward Elias, whose tiny fingers immediately tightened around Naomi's sleeve at the sound of her voice changing. The baby's lower lip trembled slightly. Naomi felt her chest ache. Adrian noticed too. "Stay another day," he said carefully. Naomi looked up in surprise. Adrian walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the bright Manhattan skyline before continuing. "The doctors will come again this afternoon. I want them to see him like this." Naomi hesitated. The request sounded simple on the surface, but she understood instinctively that it meant something deeper. Hope frightened people who had been grieving too long. Adrian wanted witnesses before he allowed himself to believe the change was real. Elias suddenly rested his head against Naomi's shoulder with a sleepy little sigh, already comfortable enough to drift toward another nap. Naomi stared at the child quietly. 24 hours ago she had been scrubbing subway platforms beneath fluorescent lights while strangers stepped around her without looking twice. Now she stood inside a billionaire's penthouse holding the only thing that seemed capable of calming his son. Life changed direction so quietly sometimes it barely made a sound. Adrian turned back toward her again. Morning sunlight softened the exhaustion in his face, though grief still lingered beneath it like an old scar. "You do not have to decide right now," he said gently. Naomi blinked softly. Gentle was not a word she ever expected to associate with Adrian Kong. Before she could answer, an older woman entered carefully from the hallway carrying a silver tray filled with fruit and tea. Naomi recognized her immediately as the housekeeper who had silently supervised the staff the night before. The woman stopped short when she saw Elias asleep peacefully against Naomi's shoulder. Her eyes widened visibly. "Oh my," she whispered before covering her mouth lightly with one hand. Adrian noticed the reaction immediately. "He slept through the night," he said quietly. The woman looked genuinely emotional. "Mr. Kong," she breathed softly, "that has not happened since Mrs. Kong passed." Silence settled gently over the kitchen. Naomi suddenly understood something important. Last night had not only changed Elias. It had changed everyone living inside these walls. Grief had controlled this home for months like a storm that never ended. Staff whispered instead of speaking. Music disappeared. Sleep disappeared. Joy disappeared. But now sunlight filled the penthouse again while a baby slept peacefully in the arms of a woman nobody would have noticed 2 days ago. The older housekeeper smiled faintly toward Naomi before quietly leaving the room again. Adrian watched the interaction thoughtfully before speaking in a softer voice than ever. "You brought peace back into this home," he said. Naomi looked down at Elias sleeping against her shoulder and gently kissed the top of his curls before answering with the kind of truth grief teaches people after everything unnecessary has fallen away. "No," she whispered softly. "I think your son simply reminded everyone that it was still possible." Naomi stayed through the afternoon. Then through dinner. And somehow, by the time Manhattan began glowing beneath another velvet blue evening sky, nobody inside the penthouse questioned her presence anymore. The doctors arrived shortly after noon expecting another exhausting consultation filled with crying, panic, and impossible recommendations. Instead, they found Elias asleep peacefully beside Naomi on the living room sofa while soft jazz drifted quietly through the penthouse for the first time in months. The older pediatric specialist stared openly in disbelief before carefully checking the baby's heartbeat and temperature twice as though afraid the calm might vanish if acknowledged too quickly. Adrian stood near the windows during the entire examination, silent and watchful, but Naomi noticed something different about him now. The tension that once filled every room around him had softened. Not disappeared completely. Men like Adrian Kong carried darkness too long for that. But grief no longer looked like the only thing keeping him alive. By evening, sunlight faded from the marble floors and the city outside transformed into rivers of gold beneath the glass towers of Manhattan. Elias spent most of the day laughing softly whenever Naomi hummed the old lullaby under her breath. Each tiny sound seemed to heal something invisible inside the penthouse. Staff members smiled again. The housekeeper placed fresh flowers near the piano. Even Adrian finally poured himself coffee instead of untouched whiskey. Naomi noticed all of it quietly. Grief had frozen this home in time after Hannah died. But children always knew how to lead people back toward life. Late that evening, Naomi finally stood near the service elevator holding her old hoodie folded over one arm while Elias rested sleepily against Adrian's chest. The baby no longer cried when separated from her now, though his tiny hand still reached toward Naomi instinctively every few seconds. Adrian looked down at his son before lifting his eyes toward her again. "You changed him," he said softly. Naomi shook her head gently. "No," she answered. "I think he just needed somebody to stop treating his sadness like a problem." Adrian stared at her quietly for a long moment. Then, with the honesty of someone too exhausted to hide behind pride anymore, he admitted, "I did not know how." Naomi understood. Powerful people often spent their lives fixing things with money, control, and solutions. But grief did not obey power. Children did not heal through fear. They healed through safety. Through warmth. Through feeling loved even in silence. The elevator doors opened softly behind her. Naomi looked once more around the penthouse that no longer felt cold. Music drifted quietly near the piano. Warm light reflected across the marble floors. And in Adrian Kang's arms, Elias rested peacefully against his father's chest instead of screaming into the night. Hope had finally learned its way home. Adrian stepped closer before Naomi entered the elevator. "Would you come back tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at the child smiling sleepily against his father's shoulder and felt something inside her chest soften in a way she had not allowed herself to feel since losing Caleb. Not romance. Not fantasy. Something gentler than that. The understanding that broken people sometimes save each other simply by being seen. Naomi smiled softly. "Yes," she whispered. The elevator doors slowly closed while Adrian remained standing beneath the warm amber lights holding his son close for the first peaceful night in months. And somewhere high above the glowing streets of Manhattan, a grieving home finally remembered what love sounded like again. Sometimes healing does not arrive through wealth, power, or medicine. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the arms of someone the world almost overlooked. And if this story touched your heart, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change a life.